1 year after the original release of the SNES, the system didn't have much to show for RPGs. Final Fantasy IV was released to some fanfare, but didn't sell well in North America. Draken was released to much less acclaim, and faded into obscurity. There just weren't that many RPGs at the time, and Capcom wanted to try their hand at creating one in 1993. Enter Breath of Fire, a traditional turn-based game that began an epic franchise. Breath of Fire features random encounters much like most traditional RPGs. Compared to later games, the encounter rate is pretty high too, which seemed normal at the time, but definitely would frustrate modern players. The good thing is that this game incorporated an auto battle feature that can be used to speed through simple encounters, and can also be cancelled at any time with a press of the B button. Combat is turn-based, and you can have up to 4 members in your party at one time. The battles take place in an isometric view, which was definitely a novel concept back then. The battle animations for attacks and spells were actually done pretty well, and provided something few other games of the time did. Another thing I liked about this game was that each enemy, even the bosses, have a visual health bar that decreases as they take damage. This was especially helpful because it allowed players to plan their attacks accordingly. Spells require ability points, which serve as Breath of Fire's version of magic points. Breath of Fire has received some criticism for requiring a lot of grinding to level. Indeed, you can get absolutely wrecked if you travel too far without leveling a bit and upgrading your gear. In all honesty though, most RPGs of this era were like this, and it certainly didn't stand out as an extreme deviation from the norm. However, if you only like RPGs where you can avoid enemies on the screen or random encounters in general, this may be a problem for you. Like most games of its kind, the title uses anime-style artwork. Though there are some dark moments in the story, most of the sprites are pretty bright and colorful. The color palette doesn't come off as dark as, say, Final Fantasy VI. Because the game was released relatively early in the SNES's life cycle, it unfortunately lacks some of the graphical enhancements later games made use of, such as non-battle sprite animations. Overall, I think the best aspect of Breath of Fire was the music. The score is nostalgic and memorable, and when I returned to play the game, it brought back many memories. The intro, called Starting the Journey, is definitely one of my favorites, and its uplifting and triumphant feeling leaves the player with an impression that an epic quest is ahead of them. For an early era SNES RPG, the soundtrack was great. Breath of Fire's story revolves around clans based on legendary creatures and animals. The main protagonist Ryu is part of the Dragon Clan, a group that's been driven to near extinction by the Dark Dragon Clan. Real creative, right? As a young orphan, Ryu was taken care of by his sister Sarah, who can use powerful summoning magic. However, their village is soon set ablaze by Emperor Zog and the Dark Dragon Clan, and Sarah is taken captive while trying to save the clan. Along his adventure, Ryu meets several allies, including the dog-like Bo, Karn the Thief, the angel-like Nina, a fish creature named Gobi, a Naga named Blue, a strongman named Ox, and the mole-like Mogu. They all work together in various ways to overcome adversity, and have character development similar to what you would find in Final Fantasy IV. The other cool facet of the various characters is that each has a special skill that can be used on the world map. This allows you to find special items, discover secret passages, and even fly around the world. Unfortunately, I do think the game's English translation suffers quite a bit. The game was published by Squaresoft, but at that point, the company didn't pour great resources into localization efforts, a cold truth that can be seen from the earliest moments of the game. Most RPGs of this era, including some of the most popular titles like Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy VI, were translated by 1 or 2 people in extremely small windows of time. This made it almost impossible to guarantee a quality English translation, and Breath of Fire is the perfect example. Breath of Fire's other glaring defect, I think, is the fact that there is so little text space for item names. Because the Japanese language can be used to convey meaning with much less space, the translators were forced to shorten the English item names to the point where they're almost indecipherable. Breath of Fire didn't get too much acclaim from what I remember at the time, though it was featured in Volume 62 of Nintendo Power. At that time, RPGs just really hadn't taken off in the West like they did in Japan through the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy series. The good thing about playing Breath of Fire today is that there's a Game Boy Advance version of the game that adds several beneficial changes. That version adds a dash button, made the menus a little bit better, and lowered the overall encounter rate. The items still have shortened names, which is annoying, but the GBA counterpart is still superior in many ways. Ultimately, Breath of Fire was the first in what became a very well recognized series of 6 RPGs. All the games are spiritual successors of each other too, with similar themes like Dragon Clan, Ryu is the lead protagonist, and a medieval fantasy style. While I think the earlier games in the series were actually better, the franchise as a whole is widely respected among RPG enthusiasts. As a series, Breath of Fire still gets some notoriety today, and fans often request that it be rebooted. Overall, Breath of Fire is a quintessential early 90s RPG. It has a fantasy story with a lively cast of characters and an epic-oriented soundtrack. A first playthrough will last you about 30 hours, which is pretty solid for an SNES game. The game's also very cheap compared to other RPGs on the system, which is great news for collectors. While I don't think the game is a true masterpiece as far as RPGs go, it was an honorable first dive into the genre by Capcom, and will still please fans of the genre that haven't gotten around to playing it before. In 1993, the Breath of Fire series began on the SNES. The original title was Capcom's first foray into the genre, a traditional RPG released when there were few on the system. The first Breath of Fire was a pretty solid RPG, and was superior to many of its counterparts at the time. Nevertheless, it did have a few defects, namely that the English localization was poorly done. With Breath of Fire 2 released in 1994, the following year, Capcom had every opportunity to rectify the few issues with the original and create a completely polished title. And unfortunately, they failed at doing this. The English translation of Breath of Fire 2 is even more brutal than the first game. Here there are worse grammatical errors, odd word choices, and sometimes flat-out nonsensical sentences. And seriously, what is a back mountain anyway? This difference was likely the direct result of Capcom deciding to localize the game themselves, rather than using Squaresoft as they had with the first Breath of Fire game. By that point, Squaresoft had several relatively successful RPG localizations under their belt, but Breath of Fire 2 was Capcom's first attempt, and in this way it was a definite disappointment. So much of the text is just plain awkward and out of place. Thanks to the internet age though, the entire game was eventually retranslated via a patch that could be applied to a ROM of the game. This version corrects all the absurdities, and it reads a lot better from beginning to end. After this was released, I can't go back to the original version because the patch makes the experience so much better. I'll include a link to this patch in the description below in case you want to pick it up. Outside of my qualms with its translation, Breath of Fire 2 still has many redeemable facets that make it worth playing. The combat UI and experience were even better than the first, which was refreshing to see. Also, the noteworthy battle animations from the first are improved upon, and the isometric combat view built upon a unique aspect of the original. Just look at Ryu slicing through enemies, yeah! The battle animations were probably among the best the system had to offer, and the combat sound effects were great too. The main protagonist is Ryu, who lived with his father and sister until he was 6 years old. One day, his sister went wandering to the sleeping dragon near town, and his father saved them both from a monster attack. Ryu's sister said she went there to fall asleep and dream of their deceased mother, and tells Ryu to try doing so. After he does though, he returns home to find that no one knows who he is. Both his father and sister are now missing, and the town is filled with other inhabitants. After seeking refuge in the church and meeting the dog-like Bo, they are confronted by an evil demon that calls Ryu a destined child. After 10 years of time has passed, the two grow older and work for Father Hulk, who assigns them various tasks. From there, they strike out on a journey together. In general, the story in Breath of Fire 2 is dark and brooding, and there's some definite religious overtones here, which was a bit rare for an SNES game. Overall, I think the story is excellent, and a step above what is to be found in the first Breath of Fire game. Another great thing about Breath of Fire 2 is the characters. The first game had a pretty stellar cast, but this one takes a big step forward in terms of story and character development. Nina is back as an angel-like being, and Blue is back as a hidden character. One of my favorites was Rand, an armadillo-like strongman and member of the Shell Clan. He works at the Colosseum and helps Ryu foil a murder plot. The other character I was drawn to was Sten, a monkey-like performer in Windia. Though he seems like an immature prankster throughout much of the game, He grows a lot, and when the party finds out he's actually a respected war hero to his people, it's a really great moment. Like the first game, each of the characters has a special skill to help the party advance through the story. These abilities can be used when each respective character is made into the leader of the party. One thing that stands out about Breath of Fire 2 is the unique ending system. Depending on what you do in the game, you receive one of 3 distinct endings. I won't divulge the exact details of the story or how to get each ending or anything, but the hardest ending to get is also definitely the best. It leaves the player with a true conclusion that otherwise wouldn't be had under a normal playthrough. Breath of Fire 2 doesn't come close to touching Chrono Trigger's broader variety of endings, but it still stands out and adds replay value that can't be found in typical RPGs. Compared to the first game, Breath of Fire 2 changed things up a bit when it came to the soundtrack. The score for the original game was composed by 4 separate Capcom employees, but Breath of Fire 2's soundtrack was created entirely by Yuko Takahara. I consider it an improvement upon the original game, and while the score isn't a work of art like some of the most eminent RPGs on the SNES, it's really quite respectable. Just like the first game, Breath of Fire 2 is available on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, and it's pretty good in a few ways, but unfortunately it retains the verbatim original translation. I definitely recommend this game to all RPG enthusiasts who haven't played it, but the best version to play is with the newer translation patch. Overall, Breath of Fire 2 is a definite step up from the original game, at least if you can get over the horrendous translation. In every other way, it excels beyond the bounds of the first Breath of Fire, and has a great combat system, fun and interesting characters, and a very solid soundtrack. In my estimation, it's the best game in the Breath of Fire franchise, and it still holds up pretty well today. When Capcom jumped into the RPG market in 1993 with Breath of Fire, it came as a big surprise to many players at the time. The company had achieved immense success on the backs of many other types of games, including action platformers and beat-em-ups, so the attempt to capitalize on the RPG market represented a strategic shift. After attracting new fans with the first 2 Breath of Fire games, it intended to bring its flagship series into the next generation on the PlayStation. Breath of Fire 3 came out on the system in the spring of 1998, just after the Final Fantasy VII craze dominated everyone's attention. Like the previous Breath of Fire games, the main protagonist is Ryu, a member of the ancient Brood race with the power to transform into a dragon. As the game begins, he's encased in a crystal within a cavern. Miners discover him there and attempt to use dynamite to kill him. Failing to do so, however, they only break his shell. He nearly escapes, but is knocked out from a crane and imprisoned. While the miners attempt to transport him away, he manages to break free and transforms into a human as he loses consciousness. He's found by the tiger-like Ray, who takes him in and introduces him to his thievery operation. Ryu doesn't understand his heritage or abilities, and the title's story centers primarily upon his search for identity. I do think parts of the dialogue are awkward, but not as awkward as some of the text in the first 2 Breath of Fire games. It was a definite improvement over those 2, but still not as polished as nearly anything Squaresoft put out at the time. I would even go as far as to call the text too basic and rudimentary too, which is a bit unorthodox compared to some other RPGs designed for older audiences. I just feel like the localizers could have gotten a little bit more creative with what read as mostly stale. The text also scrolls by exceedingly slow on the default setting, and even if you change it to the fastest setting, I still find it a bit slow. All that said, there's some really interesting story concepts here. Subjects related to Ryu's heritage are expanded a great amount, and it makes for a much more enjoyable experience that reaches a mature audience. Friendship, camaraderie, and vengeance are all prevalent themes too, pretty much as you'd expect them to be. But overall, I do think it's a deeper and more interesting storyline than the previous installments. It's a bit annoying how long it takes Ryu to change into adult form though, and I think a lot of the early storyline could have honestly been cut out entirely. Still, the cast of characters is pretty strong. Ray and Gar were my favorites, and both have excellent backstories that added needed flavor to the adventure. Like previous Breath of Fire games, Nina also plays a role here too, this time as the Princess of Windia and member of the Wing Clan. There's also another character that's, well, an onion named Pico who cannot speak. Right. Unlike the first two games in the series, Breath of Fire 3 uses an isometric view, which provides a nice contrast to its predecessors. The sprites are just beautiful, especially many of the enemies. The gigantic bosses look awesome as well. Just check this dude out. And there's tons of baddies that look equally imposing. Tons of colorful detail and shading make the visuals very impressive. You can just tell the developers spent a lot of time making things look really good. Battle animations are on point as well. They look really great, and this is some of the best sprite work on the entire system if you ask me. As far as battles go, it's pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a Breath of Fire game. You can attack, use special abilities, or use items in a turn-based affair. The characters gain unique special abilities as they level, each of which fit into their own niche or archetype. Each special ability expends AP, making their usage very similar to what is seen in most RPGs. Throughout the game, Ryu also finds new genes. When combined, they allow him to transform into dragons of different types. I really like this system because it encouraged the player to amass more genes and find the most powerful combinations. There's even a way to save combinations for future use, so you'll never forget them. The dragon transformation system was a really fun mechanic that stood out, and it deserves even more praise because it fit well into Ryu's character arc. Breath of Fire 3 also allows your characters to serve as apprentices to various non-player characters you find throughout the adventure. This association grants you certain stat increases when you level, and allows for more character customization in general. Dungeon design is pretty solid overall, but there are still some annoying puzzles. The isometric view also makes it necessary to pan the camera around to see hidden switches, chests, and other things you'll want to notice. It's also worth mentioning that the overworld was done really well too. I thought it had a good aesthetic, and you don't get into any random encounters either. This is refreshing because the dungeons are packed with monsters, and the game errs on the grindy side. The title's soundtrack was created by Akari Kaida and Yoshino Aoki, newcomers to the series that had worked on Mega Man X3. When it came out, the score was polarizing because it featured a lot of jazz and ragtime-inspired tracks. GamePro even went as far as to publish an article saying the music seemed more appropriate for a corporate infomercial than a heroic fantasy RPG. Even still, a lot of the fans really love the music and appreciate it nonetheless. It's definitely unorthodox, but I think it's pretty solid. Breath of Fire 3 was also re-released on the PSP, which featured almost the same game in its entirety, but with a few small changes. If you're trying to decide which system to play it on, it really doesn't matter that much in my eyes. A lot of fans consider this one the best in the Breath of Fire series, and I can see why. It's packed with many hours of great gameplay, has some pretty fun characters, and features a unique system for combining dragon genes. There's a few callbacks and cameos from characters from the previous games too, which will definitely please fans of the series. I do have some gripes with Breath of Fire 3, especially in regard to some of the dialogue, but overall it's a very solid RPG on the PlayStation that deserves to be played by fans. By the year 2000, the Sony PlayStation had established itself as the most respected platform for console role-playing games. Squaresoft, Enix, and Konami all contributed memorable entries including the Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Suikoden titles. Not to be outdone, Capcom also brought its flagship RPG series to the system in the form of Breath of Fire 3. The game received a positive reception and praise from publications, prompting the company to develop a second Breath of Fire entry on the PlayStation, Breath of Fire 4. Interestingly enough, Breath of Fire 4 had a graphical presentation that looked quite a bit different from Breath of Fire 3, even though much of the same team worked on the game. Even though the title retains the isometric view, the overall aesthetic and sprites are a bit darker and give a more mature appearance. The world is rendered in 3D, while the characters themselves are 2D sprites. Normal enemies are also 2D sprites, but boss enemies are built from 3D polygons. This made them stand out, but it did create something of a visual disconnect. There's also a pretty awesome opening cinematic, which was a bit of a surprise given it was the first time the franchise ever did this. For combat, you still control 3 characters at a time, but there are several key differences in relation to the previous games. Breath of Fire 4 allows you to choose which characters perform actions in any order you wish. Additionally, the player is able to toggle between characters with no penalty at all, which provides an opportunity to conserve AP and utilize the talents of each. Ryu still has the ability to transform into dragons, but it works a bit differently in this one. Instead of combining dragon genes together to produce a wide array of forms like in Breath of Fire 3, you gain transformations in Breath of Fire 4 as a whole. The downside is that there's only 6 total transformations, and Ryu assumes the same appearance for all of them. They were really powerful, but I preferred the more customizable approach that Breath of Fire 3 offered. The biggest innovation of Breath of Fire 4 battles is definitely the combo system, which allows 2 or more abilities among multiple party members to be combined with each other for special bonuses or effects. You can string such combos together to create very powerful attacks, and the game successfully incentivized replay by encouraging the players to learn additional combos. Breath of Fire 4 features a unique story, but borrows heavily from various themes and characters from the previous games. It all starts when the winged Princess Nina and her friend Cray set out on a journey to find her lost sister, who went missing several weeks earlier. Their vehicle gets upended by a giant dragon in the desert, causing Nina to go searching for equipment needed for repairs. As she does so, she confronts the dragon who destroyed the ship, which shockingly transforms into a human boy. Unique to Breath of Fire 4, though, is a story that unfolds in parallel to Ryu's story. This features Fu Lu, an emperor god of sorts that awakens from his tomb after a deep century-spanning sleep. His tale involves his attempt to reclaim his empire, which has been overtaken by a rival faction. I won't get into exactly how, but both his and Ryu's stories are intertwined in several ways, and I really enjoyed how the narrative was presented in separate tales. In some ways, it reminded me a bit of the dynamic between Squall and Laguna in their respective stories in Final Fantasy VIII. I also liked the cast of characters, which incorporated some new archetypes, such as those of Cray and Urshan. For the most part, it wasn't just the same old characters rehashed or reskinned. There's also character-specific abilities too, which make each stand out from the others in ways similar to the previous games. As in Breath of Fire 3, there's also a master system where playable characters can gain stat increases and skills after fulfilling specific requirements. I think the most annoying aspect of this game is definitely the camera system. Though I do like the isometric view, there's only 4 camera angles that you can rotate through. This becomes an issue in areas where there's lots of vertical buildings and other objects that obstruct your view. In some places it's such that you'll probably be spending more time swinging the camera around than you do actually walking through the area. That's utterly frustrating. If you thought the camera system in Xenogears was annoying, you'll despise the camera in this one even more. Another thing that will come as a surprise to Breath of Fire fans is that there's no longer a world map, at least not in the same way it existed before. In this one, the world map consists of a linear set of locations you move through as automatic nodes, and it operates much like Super Mario World or Final Fantasy Tactics. I prefer the world map system of Breath of Fire 3, where there were no random encounters, but you could at least roam around. The soundtrack in Breath of Fire 4 was created by Yoshino Aoki, who is also behind the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack. However, this one definitely adopts a different style than its predecessor. Breath of Fire 3's soundtrack was influenced by jazz and ragtime, but Breath of Fire 4 uses a more traditional formula. It's a bit darker with more strings, horns, and woodwinds. In my mind, Breath of Fire 4's soundtrack fits the type of game it is better than its predecessor, even though both are very good scores. I have to hand it to Aoki for showing her skills off with an alternative style, and her talent for multiple approaches is pretty impressive. Ultimately, Breath of Fire 4 was a title I liked, but didn't love. The camera system was a bit of a drag, and the dragon transformation wasn't as well done. Still, there are a lot of redeemable facets too. Combat was fluid, the swapping and combo system for battles added creative new dynamics, and the character animations were also very polished. I liked the way in which the story was presented, but the story itself wasn't as interesting as it could have been. The dialogue was more polished than any previous Breath of Fire title, which was definitely refreshing given the awkwardness of the text in some of the previous entries. If I had to choose which game was better between Breath of Fire 3 and Breath of Fire 4, I'd probably pick Breath of Fire 3 by a slight margin. Either way though, it's a must play if you're a fan of the series, but if you don't like the Breath of Fire games, you probably won't like this one either. After Breath of Fire 4 was released in the last days of the PlayStation, Capcom turned its attention to Sony's next-generation platform, the PlayStation 2. Even for a company that had accomplished so much in many other genres of games, Breath of Fire had become one of the leading RPG series in the world, and a very respectable franchise in its own right. Fans of the series were understandably elated then when Capcom announced the development of Breath of Fire 5 Dragon Quarter in 2002. Interestingly enough, the version that reached North America the next year was rebranded to drop the number 5 for some reason, so here it was only called Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter. When you fire this game up, the first thing you'll realize is how different the graphical style is compared to the other Breath of Fire games. It's exaggerated, cartoony, and features these odd-looking thick black lines on the edges of the characters and enemies. If you ask me, the whole visual presentation is a big disappointment. It looks like something so alien to the series, and is especially substandard since the other Breath of Fire games have such beautifully designed sprites. Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter does try to replicate some aspects of the Breath of Fire series though. Like the others, the main character is Ryu, but this one takes place in a futuristic world where the planet's population has dwindled and people are forced to live in underground hideouts below the planet's surface. The society is ruled by a mysterious group called the Regents and features a rigid caste system. This is transpired because of the misuse of dragons, powerful genetically engineered beings. Nina returns as well as a young girl and test subject of an experimental process that has made her mute. The main story arc involves Ryu and Nina's quest to escape to the surface with the help of a friend named Lin, and a lot of hurdles in their way. The game's subtitle of Dragon Quarter comes from a reference to the game's caste system, as the highest D ratio score a human can achieve is 1/4. I'll give credit to Capcom for taking a big risk to make the story of the 5th Breath of Fire so different from its predecessors, but just like the visual changes, I don't think that risk paid off. Like the other Breath of Fire titles, dragon transformation is also involved here. However, unlike several of the transformation systems, including the fan-favorite Dragon Gene system from the 3rd Breath of Fire game, this one only allows Ryu to transform into a single dragon. I have a lot of criticisms for this title, but the battle system isn't half bad. You have a resource called ability points that is spent on various attacks, with each character having a limited amount and each attack using a different number. If you create strings of gradually more powerful attacks, they become combos that do bonus damage, and you can choose less actions in one turn to store ability points for the next. It was actually a pretty creative system that reminds me a lot of Xenogears, and I thought this part of the game was its most redeeming characteristic. The soundtrack for Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter was created by Hitoshi Sakimoto, who had an extensive career as a composer and had already crafted many popular scores prior to this one. It's a huge soundtrack with lots of infectious tunes, and certainly another one of the game's bright spots. It's a little different from the style of the previous Breath of Fire games though, since it was created by a newcomer to the series, but I think it meets the expectations that fans of the franchise would have. If you enjoyed the soundtracks for Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII, you'll certainly like this one as well, since Sakimoto did those too. The visuals, characters, and story just didn't land for me, but at least the combat system was creative and the soundtrack was fantastic. The game isn't terrible in its own right, but having the Breath of Fire name attached did a big disservice to it in my mind. It was just too big of a departure for the series, despite some loose thematic similarities. Maybe some hardcore Breath of Fire fans would want to go back and play this one again, but I wouldn't. There's far better RPGs to revisit from this era. Even though Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter was quite a bit different from previous games in the franchise, it did earn some praise from gaming publications and fans. By the time it came out in 2002, Breath of Fire was one of the most recognizable RPG franchises, and gamers still yearn for more. For the next decade, however, the series seemed to fade into the twilight as others, such as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, continued to get releases while Breath of Fire didn't. During this period, fans petitioned Capcom for a follow-up. After all the pleading and the passage of over 13 years, They eventually did just that with Breath of Fire 6, Guardians of the White Dragon. There were a few problems though. It came in the form of a mobile game for Android and iOS, was only released in Japan, and was nothing like the other Breath of Fire games. Breath of Fire 6 was a multiplayer handheld action RPG of sorts where you hack and slash at enemies rather than fight turn-based battles. You choose from a male or female protagonist at the start of the game, who is the sibling of Ryu. Nina shows up as a support character as well, and you can eventually transform into a dragon, but from what I can tell, these are the only connections the title had to Breath of Fire. In this one, you walk through various environments battling enemies, recruiting AI-controlled partners called fellows, and customize your character in various ways. You can eventually build up a hub village of sorts, complete mission quests with up to 4 players at a time, and gain gradually more powerful abilities as you advance. It's mostly a mindless hack and slash though, and there isn't really much incentive to keep playing. Capcom also included microtransactions to offset the free-to-play approach, but this only seemed to upset fans. I will give the game credit for one thing, the soundtrack. Even though it wasn't created by series mainstays Hitoshi Sakimoto, Yoshino Aoki, or Yuko Takehara, this one is really good in its own right. It's an interesting score of classical music that was actually pretty impressive. Anyway, Breath of Fire 6 got panned by critics and players alike and was slammed in the presses. The negativity resulted in Capcom shutting down the game completely in 2017, citing changes in the external environment. However, no one should really be disappointed by this. Even if Capcom wanted to expand into mobile and make a game like this, placing the Breath of Fire label on this one was a big slap in the face to fans of the series. Even if Breath of Fire fans could still check out Breath of Fire 6 today, they probably wouldn't want to. Since the blunder that was Breath of Fire 6, Capcom has left the series in the dustbin of history, but that doesn't mean the company's executives haven't been asked about it. In the late 2000s, several high-ranking Capcom employees went on the record saying there weren't any plans to continue the series, but Capcom has been mostly mum about the subject since then. Regardless of Capcom's disregard though, Breath of Fire fans will probably be excited to learn that a game currently in development, Tears of Magic, aims to be a spiritual successor to Breath of Fire. The effort is being funded by a Kickstarter campaign, spearheaded by a small but dedicated team that describes it as a love letter to the franchise. It's a turn-based, classic RPG in the same style, complete with a similar visual presentation, seamless transition from map to battle, combined attacks between multiple party members, and, of course, dragon transformation. Unlike many projects like this, such as those for the upcoming spiritual successors to Suikoden and Wild Arms, Tears of Magic doesn't involve former developers that worked on its respective series. However, it does include musical arrangements from Yoshino Aoki, who created the soundtracks for Breath of Fire 3 and 4. This is a game all fans of the series should look forward to in the future, but it won't use Capcom's actual intellectual property of Breath of Fire. Despite Capcom's recent lack of attention to Breath of Fire, it should be remembered as one of the pivotal RPG franchises that captivated the West when the genre was young, and built a legion of fans that still remember it fondly today. I know it's pretty much inescapable for the series not to be compared to rival RPG series like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and fans will always have their favorites, but Breath of Fire is definitely a franchise that stands on its own merits no matter how you rank it. Without a doubt, its legacy can't be denied. The gripping stories, beautiful sprites, unforgettable soundtracks, and dragon transformations all combine to make Breath of Fire timeless. I'd be a liar if I said it wasn't a big part of my own childhood, and I know the same is true for many watching this video. As to whether Capcom will pull it out of the shadows of history and breathe life into it again, odds don't look too good right now, but never say never. In an age where retro RPGs are making a comeback of sorts, it could be on the horizon. So, what do you think was the best game in the Breath of Fire series, and why? Let me know in the comments below. I know some of you watching this will also have nostalgic stories from playing these titles, so let me know those as well. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell for more retro gaming content, and please join my Discord community linked in the description. Also, please consider supporting my channel via YouTube's Join feature to receive member exclusives, such as advanced videos and complete video transcripts.